How's it going, everybody? Welcome into the Skyline Sports Podcast. I am your host, Jack Hartman, joined, as always, by my good buddy out there on the West Coast, Nick Normand. Nick, how you doing today, man?
Doing well, doing well. Really stoked to be back with you today, Jack. Really pleased with how the season's going. College football, NFL, spending a bunch of time with friends. Had a lot of friends in town watching a lot of sports lately, and it's been a
Nice.
whole bunch of fun. Not always the best stuff going on, especially for your Lions. A little sour with the sweet in the game last week, but really stoked to be back with you. Really happy that we're back at it, chopping it up again. So, doing well. How about yourself today?
Yeah, doing well. Valerie turned 2 months old on Wednesday. Wednesday as of recording this. And yeah, we have hit the, I guess, 2 month little wall where sleeping and eating becomes more frustrating. But that's just that's life. That's life with a newborn. So we're we're just taking the punches and pushing on. But I'm happy, really happy to be able to get a little break to in this pocket of time to talk some sports, talk some football, talk some trades. We had a couple big trades earlier this week. One that was, the blockbuster one, but we all saw coming with Devontae Adams being traded to the Jets. But then the Bills go out and they're like, you know what, we're not going to wait around, and they go and they trade, just across Lake Erie with Cleveland for Amari Cooper. And so, Nick, let's talk about these. Which of these two trades? Let's start with this. Which of these first two trades do you think moves the needle more?
So I would say that Devontae Adams for the Jets probably moves the needle more just because I feel like the Jets' floor right now is lower than the Bills. The Bills, I feel like, have a very high floor with Josh Allen as their quarterback. So the Bills, I feel like they don't have as much variance necessarily as far as how much higher they can jump adding a receiver. But I feel like the Jets, because their offense has been putrid this year, they haven't been able to run the ball consistently. They haven't been able to throw it consistently. I feel like injecting a better player than Amari Cooper in Devontae Adams and in a situation where I feel like Aaron Rodgers needs another receiver. Josh Allen can use one. Aaron Rodgers needs another guy. And so I feel like Aaron Rodgers adding another dude with chemistry, adding a really talented player who's been very productive should be a really good match and really move the needle.
You know, that's what everyone's been saying. And the thing that I just can't wrap my mind around is how is he going to play offensive line and catch passes? Because you know what? The Jets have wide receivers. They have Garrett Wilson, they have Alan Lazard, they have Mike Williams, which apparently he and Rodgers are having some issues, but still, it's not like the Jets are like the Chiefs right now that it's like we will take anybody that will suit up and wear a number that starts with an 8 so that you can play wide receiver for us. Right? Like it's not like that in New York. And so I think that this is a move that felt desperate, and I think it's the move that they had to make. I just don't see how this takes them from being a 2-4 football team that had a chance to beat the Bills on Monday night and take the division to having a 2-game deficit to the Bills and somehow catching them. It's just, I think maybe this gets them to like 9-8.
Exactly.
Like
Yeah.
I think they have a really they have a really easy stretch of games for them. Um, but like coming up, but they had a really not really easy stretch, but they had games that they should have won already. And I don't look at it and say, you know what, they didn't have a receiver like Devontae Adams, and that's the reason they lost. They lost to the Vikings because of Aaron Rodgers. They lost to the Broncos because of Aaron Rodgers. Like the defense held the Broncos to 10 points. That is entirely on the offense to like score more than 10 points. Like I'm looking at some of these other games. They beat the Giants 10-6. Oh, that's preseason. What am I looking at? Sorry. That they lost to the Vikings by 6. They lost to the Bills by a field goal. And there was the interception at the end. I don't see how Devontae Adams is a guy that is going to come in and plug in and win you some of those games when the responsibility hasn't been put on yet, but should be put on Aaron Rodgers. So I actually think that the Amari Cooper trade actually moves the needle a little more. I think it gives Josh Allen a true number one receiver, which he's been making it work with Khalil Shakir and Keon Coleman, and certainly utilizing his tight ends in Kincaid and Knox.
Yeah.
But now he's got like that dude, he's got that dude that the defense is like, hey, we've got to get our best corner on this guy. We'll open things up a little bit more for those guys like Keon Coleman and Khalil Shakir. And I also think it moves the needle more because the Bills are playing chess instead of checkers, and they're trading for him so that the Chiefs can't trade for him. Because let's be real, Kansas City was going to call Cleveland, and Cleveland probably would have given him to them. Because they're not in a position that they're like, oh no, we can't make the Chiefs stronger because they're not competing for anything right now. So I think that Amari Cooper to the Bills is actually going to move the needle more. Yes, you're absolutely right that the Bills' floor is higher, but I think now it made their ceiling higher and higher than what the Jets' ceiling is now with Adams.
I hear you. I just think better quarterbacks are less reliant on stud receivers, and worse quarterbacks are way more reliant. And I think Aaron Rodgers is a noticeably worse quarterback, I would say, right now than Josh Allen, like noticeably. Aaron Rodgers is not played like a top 10 quarterback at all, not even top half of the league quarterback. And Josh Allen is solidly top 3 to 4 this year specifically, because Lamar Jackson's playing very well. CJ Stroud's playing well. Joe Burrow's playing very well. And I think Josh Allen's right up there. And I think Aaron Rodgers is playing bottom half quarterback football right now. And so I think he needs that. I don't think Josh Allen needs that necessarily. I think it helps, but yeah.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, considering the prices are similar for these receivers, so Davante Adams cost a third-round pick that can become a second-round pick. But that's not going to happen in that's if the Jets make it to the AFC Championship or Super Bowl with him on their roster, and that's just not going to happen. I would put money on that. Or if he's an all-pro this year, and that's seemingly not going to happen because he's missed games and his stats haven't been great up to this point. And so it will be insanely hard for him to be an all-pro this year. And so that's going to be a third-round pick. And for the Bills getting Amari Cooper, they gave up a third-round pick and got back a sixth-round pick too. So the difference in the trade value was basically a sixth-round pick. I feel like Davante Adams is the better player probably right now, and they got them for similar prices. And so that's kind of why I'm like, okay, the Jets got the better player for a comparable price, I feel like, too. So
Sure. So let's switch gears a little bit in talking about this trade. And now let's talk about the teams that traded their guys. Let's talk about Cleveland. Let's talk about the Raiders. I look at those two teams now and I think, okay, this kind of opens the door for these teams to be sellers now at the deadline. They're both 1-5, I think. Or have the Raiders won 2 games?
Raiders have won 2.
Yeah, the Raiders are
Raiders beat the Browns like that. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And yeah, so the Raiders are 2-4. But still, these are both teams that are not competing. It's really, really easy in both of their divisions, honestly, to know within 5 or 6 games, are we going to be competitive this year or not? Because you need to compete in the AFC West against Patrick Mahomes, and in the AFC North, you need to compete against Joe Burrow and Lamar Jackson. So it's really, really easy early on to be like, hey, do we have a chance? It's like, no, we've dug ourselves a 4-game hole, and there's no way we're going to be able to claw back out of that. So do you think that this opens the door, like the Raiders and the Browns, they're going to be selling here at the deadline and looking to really start over? Or do you think that this is a like, listen, this was a good move to get these guys off our books, and so we're doing that, but not necessarily sure that we're going to go and sell the house?
I would definitely say that this is opening the door for these two teams to be sellers. I think the Browns and Raiders are actually very similar teams, I would say, at this point, where I would say the big separator between them is that Deshaun Watson costs $1 billion. Not actually $1 billion, but costs a ton of money. Because right now, say, for example, if instead of Deshaun Watson costing the amount of money he did, he cost however much, $10 million this year, something like that. However much Gardner Minshew costs, whatever. These teams would be pretty comparable, I would say, where the Raiders have some talented players like a Max Crosby, like a Wilkins on the defensive line, like Jacoby Myers is good. Colton Miller on the offensive line is good. Like they have good players. The Browns have good players, especially on that defense. But like they both seem to have very similar issues with the offense, with running the ball, with overall offensive production. So I feel like they're kind of similar. And I feel like both of them very much have the door open to sell just about everybody. I feel like for the Browns, I would say probably Myles Garrett's off the board. Like they won't sell him. He's untouchable. But probably everybody else for a price you could get. Maybe Denzel Ward you wouldn't want to trade because like true number one corners are super hard to come by. Maybe like a Joel Bitonio because he's been a franchise cornerstone his whole career, like decade plus. Maybe like a Nick Chubb just because the team loves him coming off injury. You wouldn't want to trade him. But like I feel like Max Crosby is maybe a half a step down from Myles Garrett in terms of like wanting to keep him. But it seems like they're pretty comparable in that. And like Max Crosby, the Raiders wouldn't trade. And like Brock Bowers, I think probably for the Raiders is untouchable. But I think besides that, they'd be willing to trade everybody essentially. I feel like even Tyree Wilson, who was a top 7 pick in 2 years ago's draft, I believe, even him, a top 7 pick, like he's not untouchable. I would say he's been injury prone. He hasn't lived up to the hype. Like I feel like both of these teams should be willing to sell almost anybody essentially. And I think both of them are ripe for the picking for other teams that want to collect players.
Yeah. I'm looking right now at Cleveland and Las Vegas's rosters and what their teams look like, who they have and who they have to pay. And there are some guys starting with Cleveland that pop off that might be guys to trade. Greg Newsome, he's still on his rookie contract. That might be a good guy to move if you're Cleveland, or to make available, see what people want, or see what people would be willing to give up. Zadarius Smith also, he's on a 2-year contract. This was the first year of it, but still he's taken up $23 million right now over the next 2 years. Might be worth moving on from there. Some other guys, they have such a strong and a deep defense that like there are guys that they just have all over the place that like people would want. But looking at their offensive line, you mentioned Joel Bitonio. He's near the last year of his deal. Wyatt Teller is near the last year of his
Teller's
deal
right now, so I don't think you'd be able to trade him just because he's on IR. But
True. Michael Dunn, he was only signed for a 1-year deal. Might be able to move him. So like there's guys here. Obviously you can't move Deshaun Watson. I don't think I would be shocked if they traded Nick Chubb. Though he is only under contract for this year, so maybe they do. Just like a good running back is hard to come by. You look at a team like, oh, this would make me so sick to my stomach, but maybe Jerry finally decides, hey, let's get a running back, and he calls Cleveland, and Cleveland trades him to Dallas. Could be interesting. Then you look at the
Raiders,
the Raiders, and we're blurry, and we're back. Gardner Minshew, you mentioned his contract compared to Deshaun Watson's, and his contract is not that bad. It is the fourth highest on their on their books, and his cap hit is only $8 million. So, but they've kind of just without saying it, agree like, listen, we're tanking. Like, do we really think that Aiden O'Connell is going to win them more games than Gardner Minshew is? I don't think so. I don't think Gardner Minshew would win more games than Aiden O'Connell, but still, like, I don't know about that. So, again, we talked last week about how Miami needs to try and do something when it comes to their quarterback. Maybe, Minshew is a guy that will certainly lose you some games, but will also win you some games. So might be interesting. Obviously, I want my Lions to go after Max Crosby. We'll see if that actually happens. It would make me really happy. I'd be surprised if the Raiders actually move him. But I mean, he's getting up there in age, and if you want to reset, getting and rebuild, getting picks is the way to do that, so you can stay cheap. So, if I mean, I was saying it before the Hutchinson injury happened that like they should call about this, but now I'm like, absolutely make the call. And with Hutchinson being out, I'm like, 2 firsts, a fourth, and somebody. I'm like, do it. Like I understand that the Lions have been doing a really good job of not leveraging their future. But the fact is, like, the window is open right now with them, and without Aiden Hutchinson, I'm not convinced that their defense is good enough to win a Super Bowl. So might be able to give the Raiders something that they want. Yeah, Robert Spillane, former Steeler.
Yeah,
He's been having a good season, or a good few years. But yeah, I think it's tough, when you look at teams like this that are this bad. It's tough on like just skimming it to see where there's trade value outside of like, yeah, Myles Garrett and Max Crosby, but why would you want anybody else? But you never know. There are guys that teams have been evaluating for years, evaluated them during the draft process, stuff like that. It's. I think about last year when the Lions traded for Donovan Peoples-Jones from Cleveland, and it was like interesting trade. Didn't really do a ton, but he didn't do like he didn't hurt them either. And so you look at their trades all the time that you're like, oh, that's like their second string center. Interesting. So you never know what might happen. But I definitely think that the Browns and the Raiders are answering the phone. At least even with some of those guys, like I think the Raiders are answering the calls about Max Crosby. They might just be like, listen, you're gonna really have to woo us, but obviously at the beginning of the season they're like, absolutely not. So that's just sort of how the landscape changes.
Yeah. This Raiders team too, I'm just looking at their depth chart and oh my goodness, the lack of special players on it, like, makes me really like surprised. We're like, on offense, Brock Bowers is a special player. I think we've seen him this season have a couple of amazing games.
Yep.
Colton Miller's a good left tackle. And on the defense right now, since Wilkins is out, it's Max Crosby, and like Jack Jones can do some of that on occasion as a smaller corner. But like there are a few other like okay players. Their corner room is pretty nice, but the lack of special on their whole team is like pretty stunning to me.
Yeah.
Or if they trade Crosby, they have like a half a playmaker on their whole roster. Like they got the tight end Bowers and like nothing special, which is kind of crazy. The Browns, their defense, as you said, very deep, talented. JOK, Zadarius Smith, Myles Garrett, Dalvin Tomlinson's good. Jordan Hicks is still solid. Denzel Ward, Delpit, Martin Emerson, Newsome. Like they're deep. That's like 9-10 dudes who can play. Like those guys can play football and be positive plus contributors. And the Raiders just don't have that. So I'm like, okay, that's the separation, I guess. But both these teams, I think the phone should be ringing and they should be picking up because neither of them are going to be contenders anytime soon.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's Yeah, it's the reason there was so much hype around the Browns going into this year and so little hype around the Raiders going into this year is because you look at the roster and you're like, what do you have? Like I think of the meme of like the Lamborghini at like the like RV park or the trailer park or whatever with Devontae Adams and Max Crosby on the Raiders. Like what are what are you doing here? So and that's why I say like especially the Raiders like you'd be stupid. I mean it would be so Mark Davis, but you'd be stupid not to answer the phone and at least tell people like if you give us this, we'll give up Max Crosby. If you give us this, we'll give up Jacoby Myers because you
Mhm.
have nothing that you're trying to leverage towards the future right now. Like your future is worse looking than your current situation. So anything that you can do to help is what you want to do, but also it's the Raiders, so they might just not do anything.
Yeah. And the issue is, even if they do something, like back a couple 5 years ago or so, they made the Khalil Mack trade, they made the Amari Cooper trade, and they got 3 first-round picks out of those 2 trades. And
Hmm.
those dudes became zeros. All those first-round picks became nothing. Like the most impactful guy was Josh Jacobs, who was good. But a first-round running back, like nowadays, it's very hard to be insanely special, even as a first-round running back. And so, like the Raiders, even if they traded away Crosby, who's a certifiable dude, it's like, okay, they get back a couple of first round picks and such. I don't know that I trust them to be able to use them.
Sure.
Like Bowers is a good first round pick and Miller's solid. But out of the last 7 or 8 first round picks they've made, making one great one and one okay one out of 8 or 10 picks, like that's not good. That's just
Yeah.
not a good hit rate whatsoever. So maybe the Raiders' incompetence hold them back from even making the competent decision. So,
Right. Yeah. And now, Brady did just get approved. Tom Brady did just get approved as an owner.
mhm,
So, hopefully that will bring a little life into the room.
mm,
And I mean you can't say that he doesn't know football. Um so he might be able to help. I've heard reports that he already has called Bill Belichick to say like, hey, do you want to coach here? Now that would be really interesting that they would fire Antonio Pierce like that. But it is one of those things that it's like, listen, under new management, things happen and it's
mhm,
tough. But I understand that the locker room really, really likes Antonio Pierce, but
mm,
what has the locker room done? Like it's one of those things that it's like, oh, the locker room really likes him. Well, we're trying to do a complete overhaul of our team because it's bad.
anyway, yeah,
So what's we kept him. We definitely kept him because we knew the locker room liked him, and we were not convinced that Devontae Adams wouldn't completely hold out over the entire summer if
mhm,
if we didn't hire this guy. But that being said, the guys that we're trying to keep are gone mostly, and the guys that we have left that like him, we don't really care. So
right,
we'll see what happens with the Raiders. They're always doing something. So
yeah. Raiders are interesting if nothing else,
yep.
but yeah. Alrighty, moving on. We have a little bit of coaching hot seat to go over, Jack. So
Sure.
I'm going to name for you a couple of coaches that I have listed down here, and you're just going to tell me how hot you think their seat is. 10 being absolute hottest, like one more loss, they could be fired kind of hot, and one being like, nah, they're completely fine. They're a lock. Like they should be all good.
Sure.
First coach that I got down here is Kevin Stefanski of the Cleveland Browns.
Oh boy. Okay. So this is the weird thing. He should not be on the hot seat. He shouldn't. He is, but he shouldn't be. He is a two-time coach of the year. He has
Mhm,
taken the Browns to the playoffs 2 times during his time there. Something
mhm,
that hasn't happened, in forever, right?
mhm.
Last year he did it with Joe Flacco, with a combination of quarterbacks of Deshaun Watson, Dorian Thompson Robinson, PJ Walker, and Joe Flacco. Got them to the playoffs, right? Kevin Stefanski is not the problem here. However, if the Browns as an organization are not willing to admit that the Deshaun Watson trade was a terrible decision and are not willing to just like, listen, we got to cut our losses where they are, then he's going to become the scapegoat. And it's not fair to him. Um, I guarantee you, if it was up to him, he would have benched him for Jameis Winston already. But every week he keeps saying, nope, we're sticking with him, probably because the guys over his head are like, you have to stick with him. Um, but I feel like we have to be reaching a breaking point with with the Browns and with Stefanski, where it just has to be like, listen, like what are we doing? Why why are we still playing this guy? I mean, and you look at their schedule coming up. They have Cincinnati this week, Baltimore the following week, the
Oh,
Chargers the week after that. Then they have a bye. Then at New Orleans, Pittsburgh, at Denver, at Pittsburgh, Kansas City, at Cincinnati, Miami, and end the season at Baltimore. Like, you can't tell me through all of that you're not going to have some game that it's like, listen, the team is so bad that we're just going to bench him for the game and see what Jameis can do, and then Jameis does good, and you're like, well, shoot, what are we going to do now? So I think I would put him at like a 7, even though he deserves to be at a 1.
yeah.
But it's just I'm reading through the tea leaves. He's going to be the scapegoat because the organization isn't willing to admit that they messed up with Deshaun Watson, and that's where we're at.
Yeah, I completely hear you. It feels like this is coming top down from the owner, and the owner's trying to justify that huge contract and huge trade. But man, like he's on the hot seat, as you said, for basically not his fault of reasons. It's not his fault that they traded for Deshaun. And it seems like based on the schedule, as you were saying, like these next 3 games with the Bengals and the Ravens, and who are the third team you said?
Um,
Bye. You said Bengals, Ravens, and those
Chargers,
should be
Chargers.
lost. Chargers are good as well. But so say for example, they go into the bye like 2-7, 1-8 kind of thing. Like that seems like if Deshaun can last that long, that like that would be the turning point of like, please get him off the field. The bye is a good time to be able to get Jameis settled, and like the next couple of weeks, the Bengals defense isn't great, but I still don't think they're going to win that game. The
Yeah.
Ravens should soundly beat them, and so I feel like I don't see a lot of good on the horizon pre-bye, so that'll probably be when we see it turned over, if not sooner.
Yep. And if not that, then it's the bye and they'll fire Stefanski that week, because that's typically when the coaches get fired. And if that's the case, there should be a lot of teams that should be picking up the phone for him. There should be a lot of teams or a lot of head coaches that next year, if they're replacing their offensive coordinator, should be picking up the phone for him. If next year Ben Johnson does leave Detroit, I would love for Dan Campbell to hire Stefanski as the offensive coordinator, because you look at the success that he's had with the quarterbacks that he's had. I mean, it's incredible. So
he'd also be a great fit as a run-first offensive coordinator who's creative in his run fits and everything.
Yep.
Really good fit, I would say. Next coach that I have for you, fresh off a loss, it's Friday today. That will be Dennis Allen of the New Orleans Saints. Started off hot, has cooled off straight after 5 straight losses here. What are we feeling about Dennis Allen?
Yeah, remind me, how long has he been there?
This is year 3, I believe. Year 3, year 4. Sean Payton left, and he was the one who took over.
Right. Yeah. So I mean, what has that team done since? Also, I do feel like, the Saints have been basically in cap hell for like as long as I can remember, basically since Drew Brees retired. And Sean Payton has a lot to do with that.
Mm-hmm.
That being said, the Saints do have a talented roster. So you have to start thinking about like, listen, when are the wins going to come? The AFC South, or the NFC South, excuse me, is a better division this year than I think a lot of people were expecting. But, Atlanta or Tampa Bay isn't going to win the division at like 13-4, right? So like it's, the ability to make some noise in that division is there. And it just hasn't happened with the Saints at all yet. So I think that like yes, the start was really great. That had a lot to do with the offense, which was Kubiak. And so I think we might see a coaching change mid-season, and they make Kubiak the interim
Ooh,
and see what happens.
wow. I like it.
I think if you're New Orleans, it's just like, listen, what else are we gonna do? All of the decisions that have been made since he got hired have not worked out. Don't get me wrong, Derek Carr was having a great season before he got hurt. Great season through the first 2 games, slowed down a little bit, but still wasn't playing awful. And then he got hurt. You need a guy that can come in and can win over the locker room. Can bring some actual culture to that team that they haven't had since Peyton left. So, I don't what that's what I would do is the fire him at the bye week and make Kubiak the interim. But
Sure.
I'm going to put him at like a 5 or a 6 on the hot seat scale. Like, I don't think he's one more loss away. But also, I think if things don't turn around just right now, at least like we're looking at least like going 9-8, then it might not he might not be coming back next year.
Yeah, I completely hear you there. If you didn't watch the game yesterday, the injury luck before that game was awful. And they absolutely just got completely much more injured last night.
Yeah.
Their corner room got decimated last night, if you weren't aware of the reports. Paulson Adebo, their second, third best corner, depending on how you'd rate him, he fractured his tibia, broke his leg completely, and so he's going to be out rest of the year at least.
Yeah.
Marshawn Lattimore, their best corner, he was injured and out for the game as well. And so they were depending on Alante Taylor and rookie Kool-Aid McKinstry, and that was their whole corner room, basically. Two dudes was the whole corner room by the end of the game.
Yeah.
And so they got smoked yesterday by the Broncos. It was a beating.
Let alone Rashid Shaheed got hurt too, and he was like their spark plug on offense. So yeah.
Yeah, but this team has been brutalized by injuries. Going into the year, the offensive line was super injured even before the season started. Corner room's been decimated. Derek Carr's been injured. It just seems like the luck hasn't broken their way as far as injury luck this year. But I don't know that Dennis Allen has acquitted himself very well in spite of that, where like his defense is supposed to be his calling card, and Bo Nix did a really good job against it yesterday. Didn't throw any touchdowns, but I believe the Broncos had over 200 rushing yards yesterday.
Yeah, I had Javonte Williams on my fantasy team, my flex this week. It paid off.
Yeah, and that's just brutal because like the Saints defensive line has been pretty good this year and they haven't been getting too ran over. But to let up 200 yards to this Broncos team that hasn't been a great rushing offense and just get ran over is tough, especially for a defensive head coach.
Well, I mean, on Sunday, they played really bad too at stopping the run. They gave up 277 yards on the ground, including 136 yards to my boy Sean Tucker out of Syracuse. Finally getting his name called. Yeah. I mean, the defense. It's not like the defense has looked great this year. They look good against the Cowboys, but every defense looks really good against the Cowboys. So,
yeah, I hear you. Next up, we got Doug Peterson of the Jaguars. Very tough season to start out for the Jaguars. How are you feeling for him on the hot seat?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm putting him at a 10. I'm surprised he hasn't got it already. Like, again, and we should preface, we're not doing this because we want all these coaches to lose their jobs, but it's the reality of the situation. Like, I am really, really surprised that he hasn't been fired already. The Jags have looked terrible. Everyone was talking about like, hey, they're actually going to sneakily win the AFC South this year. I wasn't drinking that Kool-Aid, but people, you weren't the only one. There were lots of people that were saying that. There were people saying Trevor Lawrence, like he's going to have an MVP year, all of this stuff. Granted, I don't think the organization helped him by like, oh, Calvin Ridley, now you're good, you can go. But still, like the team just looks bad. They're like there is no part of that team that it's like, well, hey, at least we can hang our hat on this. So yeah, I'm putting him at a 10. I'm surprised that he hasn't been fired already. I forget what their next few games looks like. They have the Patriots, the Packers, and then the Eagles is their next 3 games. I mean, if you lose to the Patriots, the 1-5 Patriots with Drake May, who showed some signs on Sunday, also showed some of his youth, but showed some signs on Sunday. But if you lose to that team, I mean, you shouldn't even walk back into the locker room. It'll just be it'll be curtains at that. So
yeah, and that's in London. The Jaguars play multiple games a year in London. That's considered their home turf. Like, man, if you're going to lose to the Patriots overseas with this roster with a lack of any sort of offensive weapons, you at least have Brian Thomas Jr. and Etienne's injured right now, but he's a good player. Like, you got Christian Kirk, you got a couple of other receivers, you got
Evan Engram.
Evan Engram, the receiver from the Bills too. Gabe Davis is on that team. Like, you have better playmakers. They don't have great playmakers. They got better ones than the Patriots and a better quarterback seemingly than the Patriots. If you lose to this team, man, that's a pretty big indictment. I agree with you. I think a 10 is squarely where Peterson's at. If he's not fired after this year, I'd be shocked. He's going to be fired after this year, seemingly a lock. He's, I think, 1-10 in his last 11 games, something like that. They ended on a terrible stretch last year and only winning 1 game thus far this year. Just really brutal stretch between end of last season and this season. So, Yep. Next up, somebody else who hasn't acquitted themselves very well either, and somebody who I know we were talking about with regards to comparing him to your head coach right now. That will be Nick Sirianni of the Eagles, and
which I still can't believe. That. You've had some absolutely wild Detroit Lions takes the last couple of weeks that I've been like, Nick, what are you drinking right now? Like, as you're texting me these things. So the take was that Nick doesn't see much difference between Sirianni and Dan Campbell, and that basically he's preying on Dan Campbell's downfall. That in a couple of years, Dan Campbell's going to look exactly like Nick Sirianni. But that being said, I have never seen Dan Campbell not own up to his actions the way Nick Sirianni does. I've never seen Dan Campbell argue with the fans when they're upset and not say, listen, we hear you and we're just as upset. And you know what? Not even talk, just go and prove it. That year that his second year that they started 1-7. 1-7 and ended 8-9. I mean, that was the prove it year, with him and that team. So anyway, let's put that to bed. Nick Sirianni. So the weird thing about Sirianni is I'm like, what does he do for this team? Like, he's not calling plays. Kellen Moore is. He was hired as an offensive guy, but now he's not doing that. He didn't hire his coordinators this offseason. Howie Roseman and the owners did. So, like, what does he do? Like, other than yell at the fans and shave his head and bring his kids into his press conference so that he can't get bombarded by the media. So that being said, I don't know that he's actually – I think in our eyes, he's really high on the hot seat. But I also think in the eyes of the organization, it's like, well, he did take us to a Super Bowl a couple years ago. And, we're sort of – it's not like we're the Jaguars that are 1-5 right now. Granted, the end of their season was rough. After basically they beat the Chiefs on Monday Night Football in Kansas City. And then I think they won one more game the entire year. It was bad. So I don't know. I think I'd put him like at 5. I think right now it's like there's still time for this season to get turned around. And if it does, then, he might be okay for another year. But also there's the chance that this just continues to fall apart and he's gone.
Okay, I hear you. I just got to set something straight with regards to Sirianni. Because, one, with regards to him compared to Campbell, I think that the separator to me is that Sirianni was brought in somewhat as an offensive guy, but kind of as that CEO kind of culture builder. He makes the decisions on when to go for it, when to punt, kind of those type of things. And Dan Campbell makes those decisions too, when to like fake punt, when to go for it on fourth down, that kind of stuff. The clear separator to me is clearly that Sirianni cannot build a culture and is horrendous at that and like cannot be trusted with that. Dan Campbell can. He can build a culture. He's tough. He's fierce. He's relentless, all those things. So I think there is a huge gap with regards to that.
Right.
But my thing is, because neither of them are schematics guys, they're both kind of dependent on their game calling as far as like when to go for it on fourth down, when to punt, when to call fakes, that kind of stuff. And so I think they're in similar buckets with that, where I think that Dan Campbell can sometimes get way too aggressive in terms of like, there was no reason to be calling some of the trick plays against the Cowboys.
There was absolutely a reason. You and I both know the reason that the refs completely ruined
yes,
last year's game. And so they wanted to really stick it to the NFL, the referees, and the Cowboys by doing that. So,
right. I get that. But I mean, like, as a head coach, you've got to be decisive in we're smoking the Cowboys either way. And how many trick plays do you have in your book? Like, you might want to save some of these things. That's
Ben Johnson, the well is deep. So
I hear you. The point that I was making when we were speaking about this the other day is just that I feel like Sirianni, we thought very highly of him after they made the Super Bowl, but he was very dependent on Steichen, his offensive coordinator, who's a very intelligent, great offensive coordinator and is doing good things on offense with the Colts. And I think that in a similar way, Campbell has been dependent on Ben Johnson, who's a really good offensive coordinator and a really great job with the Lions. So I'm just curious if the offense struggles without Johnson. We're obviously playing hypotheticals there, but that's just where the conversation is to me with that.
Sure.
To be clear, though, you saying that Sirianni's probably about a 5 on the hot seat, I would ramp that up probably to like a 9. Like, I think Sirianni's abjectly probably a bottom 3 head coach in the league. And I think he actively sabotages himself, his team, and everything that his team's trying to do to succeed. You said, what does he do? I say the things he does are abjectly terrible and causing huge setbacks to his team. I think every decision he makes as far as calling games and choosing when to do what are abjectly terrible. His culture's awful. He riles up the fans for no reason. Everything he does is a negative. He offers no positive. Dan Campbell does some stuff that are a little questionable, but he offers a number of positives. I think Sirianni is definitely awful in terms of head coach in the NFL and should be fired at least by the end of this year, if not sooner. And I'd put a lock on that. I think there are 30 head coaches that offer more than Sirianni does as far as schematics or culture. 30 of them at least. I think he's awful.
Yeah. The thing that I will say when it comes to the Eagles is they're 3-2. They're only a half game back of Washington right now. And these are their next 4 games. At the Giants, at the Bengals, hosting the Jaguars, at the Cowboys. There is a possibility that they go and they win those 4 games, and then the team is 7-2 and in the driver's seat in the NFC East. And so that's why I say it's at a 5, because like I think there's still a lot of we got to wait and see what's happening next, and what goes on in these next 4 games. After that, then they play Washington, and maybe they go 3-1 in that stretch or 2-2 in that stretch, and then that Washington game is like if we win this game, we can really like get in control of the division, and if we lose it, then we're consistently or like significantly behind, and like that could be the time for a decision. But as ugly as the loss looked on Sunday, or as ugly as the win looked on Sunday, a win is a win. And it's not the college football playoff where they're ranking you based on your resume. It is strictly what is your record at the end of the year. And so, right. If they can go on a little run here, win these next 4 games, then he's going to keep his job. So
I don't know that he will. I think he could be winning games, but the moment there's a single other loss that like he could just explode on the media or something. Very similar to an owner we saw in an interview this week, just explode on people, and that could set off a chain reaction of him just getting kicked to the curb immediately. I think they could go 3-1 the next 4 games, and that one loss could set him up for blowing up at somebody, blowing up at the fans, and that could be the one thing, even if he's winning, that like something like that happens, which is crazy in its own right. But I think Sirianni's pretty awful in terms of being a head coach.
I agree.
Yeah. Moving on to somebody I would consider less awful. That would be Mike McCarthy of the Cowboys. They are coming off a rough week against your Lions. He has a good resume, but again, sometimes it seems like, what does Mike McCarthy do? He's not a great offensive mind. He's solid. Where would you land at with Mike McCarthy and the Cowboys?
So I don't think he qualifies for the 1 to 10 list, because I think what's going to happen is he's not going to get a contract extension after this year. Like,
Okay.
I think the Cowboys are moving on. I think it was literally, unless they won the Super Bowl, like, he's not coming back. I frankly, I am surprised that like Jerry Jones is still beating this dead horse. But Jerry Jones does really, really weird crap. So not going to act like he ever makes decisions that are logical. So I think he's done after this year, regardless, unless they go on some magic run here, make the playoffs, win a few games, actually get to the Super Bowl. Which you just look at their team, and you're like, there's no way that that's going to happen. I don't think there's any coach in the NFL that could make that happen. I don't even think you look at their offense. I don't think Andy Reid could fix their offense. I really don't, because their offensive line is so bad. They have zero run game. Like, I don't think Andy Reid could even clean that mess up. So I think he's done after this year. Will he get fired midseason? I don't know. I think last year would have been the year to get fired midseason, because you had Dan Quinn, that you could have made the interim and seen what you had with him. But like, I don't. Mike Zimmer isn't a head coach anymore. Like, that's just he's
Right. But you don't think they'd hand it over to Zimmer for the rest of the year if they go on like a 3-game losing streak or something like that and it's awful? Like, I think they could just fire him after like a 3-game losing streak or something like that. I think that's on the table.
I mean, I'm not going to rule it off the table, but I also am just like, Jerry hasn't done this before. Like, what is he? What reason does he have to do it now? This week would have been the week to do it. This week would have been the week that's like, listen, this is bad. This is really bad, and we need to fix this. And I'm going to go and I'm going to make some trades. I'm going to trade for Amari Cooper. I'm going to, call about some running backs, whatever. And I'm going to fire Mike McCarthy, and we're going to start over. That was the desperation that he had in his voice when he called that into that radio show, or when he was doing that radio show. But he's always talk, and he never backs it up. So, like, oh, we're all in. If you were all in, Mike McCarthy would have been fired by now, and he hasn't been. So,
yep. I hear you. Last on this list, we got Brian Daboll of the Giants. The Giants, not a great team. They have some good elements, but your thoughts on him?
Brian Daboll if he gets fired, none of it is his fault. He was set up to fail this year. He still has Daniel Jones as his quarterback. So let's start with that. The Giants offense looked better last year with Tommy DeVito than it did with Daniel Jones. He doesn't have Saquon Barkley anymore. Mm-hmm. He somehow, through all of that, has still been able to make Malik Neighbors look like the best wide receiver in the draft. But yeah,
I liked him better than MHJ. I always did.
Yeah. I personally, I liked Rome Odunze better than either of them, but we're not. Unfortunately, no team is calling us for our draft evaluations. So, anyway, so like, if he gets fired, it's not his fault. The fact that he was able to make Daniel Jones look good enough to get the contract that he did, and get them not just to the playoffs, but to win a playoff game on the road. Like, that was incredible. And I am certainly a what have you done for me lately when it comes to coaches. Like, I'm not quick to fire coaches, but I am quick to hold judgment against them. But he does not deserve judgment held against him. I think he might be on the hot seat just because the Giants, since Tom Coughlin left as the head coach, just haven't known what they're doing at all. Unfortunately, but I don't think he deserves to be fired.
I hear you. I think he falls into the same bucket as Stefanski. Both of them have won Coach of the Year, I believe. I believe Dable won it the year that they made the playoffs against the Vikings, I think.
I think you might be right.
Yeah, but Stefanski, 2-time Coach of the Year, Dable, 1 time, I believe. And both of them, like, clearly are good offensive minds who one of them has just changed to a worse quarterback. I think Daniel Jones isn't good, but I think Deshaun Watson is abjectly worse. And so it feels a little bit like a product of situation. But both of them, I think we can agree, are pretty good coaches.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yep. Moving on, we got a little bit of college football stuff going on this year. We had a great game between Ohio State and Oregon this last Saturday. Specifically, though, eyes this season have been on the SEC, and we had many teams that were vying from the SEC for playoff spots this year. And I just wanted to pick your brain, Jack. We got potentially 5 or 6 teams starting out this season that we thought could make the playoffs out of the SEC. And we'll just go down a couple of them since about half the year is over. And we'll just see, would you say that these teams you think are going to make the playoffs or miss the playoffs?
Sure.
First off, should be pretty easy. Will be number 1 overall Texas right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think by far Texas is the best team in the country. You know, I mean, you look at their resume. They destroyed Colorado State 52-0. They really beat Michigan at Michigan really well, 31-12. They destroyed UTSA 56-7. They destroyed University of Louisiana Monroe 51-3. They beat conference opponent, their first SEC game, as a team in the SEC, Mississippi State 35-13, and then they smoked Oklahoma in the Red River rivalry 34-3. I really feel confident about this team. I think we'll see a lot tomorrow when they play Georgia. But I mean, if they beat Georgia, like, I don't know who's beating them this year. Like, seriously, they just look so impressive. They have translated over to the SEC far better than I expected. And so I would call Texas a lock for the college football playoff.
Next up, we got the team that got Alabama being the thorn in their side again. That'd be the Georgia Bulldogs, as you were speaking about, Jack.
Yeah, so, like, here's the thing with these SEC teams is we have a lot of them that are beating up on each other, including the big dogs, your Alabama, your Texas, your Georgia, your Tennessee, but also, like, South Carolina has played really good against LSU and Alabama. Arkansas has played really good against a couple of these teams.
Kentucky, they played
Kentucky,
tough.
Absolutely. And so I'm looking at Georgia's schedule, and I think they could still suffer a loss to Texas and still find their way in. But then they also play Florida, who just had a really good game against Tennessee, at Ole Miss, against Tennessee, and against a Georgia Tech squad that is 4-2 right now and looks pretty good. And so I think they could afford to lose to Texas and maybe sneak in the 11-12 range. But I also think that they might lose 2 more games this year. In which case, I don't know how you could put a 3-loss Georgia team when right now their best win is probably they destroyed Clemson earlier in the year, but since then they've really fallen off the wagon. So yeah, I'm not sure. I don't think Georgia's going to make it this year.
Next up, we got Alabama. Kalen DeBoer, Jalen Milroe, very offensively oriented team, suffered a debilitating loss to Vanderbilt for the first time in decades. And so how are we feeling about Alabama?
Yeah, Alabama's in a similar spot when it comes to they have a lot more tough games. They still this week they're at Tennessee, they still play Missouri, and then they play at LSU. On top
Mhm.
of playing Auburn at the end of the year, that is always a tough game. It doesn't matter how bad Auburn is and how good Alabama is. That is always a hard game. And like we saw what Kalen DeBoer was able to do coaching wise when they played Georgia, looked good, but those rivalry games are just different, man. Those games that um these two teams, it doesn't matter how good one of them is over the other, it's always going to be close. I mean, you look at Ryan Day, he's beaten Michigan once, I think. Like I'm pretty sure once because I'm
Once or
pretty sure
twice, I think. Maybe twice.
maybe twice.
Yeah.
But still, like they've owned him the last 3 years. I'm concerned about Kalen DeBoer in the Auburn game. So I know I honestly man, it's tough. It's really tough to say coming off the heels of that South Carolina win that they barely got away with at home, which came right off of the loss to Vandy. So the way I'm currently looking at them, I'm seeing them losing this week to Tennessee and probably losing to LSU. But they could look really good against Tennessee this week and change my opinion. So I'm not gonna ride them off yet. But boy, is it not looking good?
Yeah. Teetering on the brink right now. Next
Yep.
up, LSU. LSU. You spoke on them for a second. Nussmeier, their quarterback, has been doing a really solid job replacing Jaden Daniels. How do we feel about LSU?
Yeah, I actually feel really good about LSU.
Mhm.
I think that they're gonna make the playoff. My
Mm.
concern is, let's say Alabama does turn it around and they end up beating LSU, and then you have a two-loss LSU team that is not even going to be competing for the conference championship, and their other loss came to USC, who's right now sitting at 3-3.
Week one.
And so I am concerned about this team if they lose another game. I think like we talked about Georgia, I think Alabama, I think both of those teams could be two-loss teams that get in. Um, I don't know if LSU could be a two-loss team that gets in because of how bad their loss was. But for right now, looking at the rest of their schedule, I feel the best about it because they're hosting Alabama this year. They are going to Arkansas this week. That looks like a really big trap game for them. But other than that, Florida, Vandy, Oklahoma is how they end their year. So I'm right now I'm surprisingly feeling better about the LSU Tigers than I do Georgia and Alabama.
Wow. Very interesting.
Yeah,
Next up, number 11, that will be the Tennessee Volunteers. Their quarterback, who started off very hot, Nico, I don't know how to pronounce his last name.
Niamaliava.
Yes, him. He has cooled off these last couple of weeks. Their defensive end, Pierce, he hasn't been having a great year when he was projected to be incredible top edge in the nation. How
Yeah,
are we feeling about the Tennessee Volunteers?
yeah. I don't think they're going to beat Bama this week.
Mm.
Um, and then they still have Kentucky, which Kentucky has played teams very well this year. And then they
Mhm.
still have at Georgia. And honestly, they're going to Vanderbilt at the end of the year. And
Mhm.
this Vandy team, man, they're gutsy, dude.
Woo!
Like
Yeah,
Vandy might beat Tennessee to end the season.
yeah.
But even if they don't, again, it's just going to be so hard now in the 12-team playoff. Like it was so hard in the 4-team playoff, but you're pretty much like, well, you win your conference, you get in. But
Mhm.
now, like there are going to be a lot of teams that could be competing for it for a playoff spot without winning the conference, but I don't think you can be a 3-loss team, competing that doesn't have conference championship that can make the 12-team playoff. I think that as good as the SEC is now, they might deal a little bit with some issues of we all beat up on each other, which means we have maybe one clear favorite, but then everybody else because oh well Oklahoma lost to Tennessee. Well, Tennessee lost to Arkansas. Well, Arkansas lost to A&M. Well, A&M lost to, and like that
Yep.
cycle really, really hurts the conference. So,
Yep. Yep. I hear you. Next up, number 14, that'd be Texas A&M. Jimbo Fisher's gone. They've beaten one ranked opponent thus far in Ole Miss. How are you feeling about Texas A&M?
yeah, Missouri. They beat Missouri.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. They lost
So,
and beat Missouri. Yes.
yeah. So at first, I was really, really low on this team. Their loss to Notre Dame was not good. And then Notre Dame went and lost to Northern Illinois. And I'm like, oh, so your quality loss now looks like really bad loss. Granted,
Mhm.
Notre Dame hasn't lost another game since. Um, but, it's, I don't know. Granted, with A&M, what they have going for them is that they're undefeated in the SEC right now. Is
Mm.
that them, like LSU, their loss is a non-conference loss, as opposed to Missouri, as opposed to Alabama, as opposed to Georgia, as opposed to Tennessee. So they still have a little bit of wiggle room. They're playing at Mississippi State this week. They should, or not this week. Yes, this week. Sorry,
Mhm.
they should win that game. They still host LSU and host Texas. But the game that I'm really, really concerned about is at South Carolina. South
Mm.
Carolina has been a gutsy, gutsy team. They almost beat LSU at home. They almost beat Alabama on the road. I feel like they're just so close to actually pulling off one of these major upsets,
Mhm.
and I think that you could see a Texas A&M team that comes in after playing LSU, and the high of that game turn into a snooze fest for them against South Carolina, which makes me nervous. I don't think A&M is making the playoff. They have to play Texas at the end of the year, and I think Texas is just going to really, really beat them. I do think that LSU is going to beat them. And so I think they've had a great, great year so far. Definitely a year to be proud of new head coach Mike Elko. But I still think they're not quite ready to be competing for the playoff.
Mhm. Next up, Kiffin's Ole Miss team. They still got to play. They're hosting Georgia in a couple of weeks. But man, I don't know if they'll be able to beat Georgia, getting a third loss. How are we feeling about them?
Yeah, Ole Miss isn't making it. They could have survived the loss to LSU if they had beaten Kentucky, or vice versa. Actually, they definitely could have survived the Kentucky loss if they had beaten LSU. But yeah, I mean they're at 2 losses now. They are so far down in the conference standings. Like they have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. They have 9 teams ahead of them in the conference standings that they would somehow need to surpass 8 of them just to even compete in the conference championship. So I think it's over for Ole Miss. There's rumors that Lane Kiffin is moving on to Florida when they fire Napier. So I think that this is a team that had the chance to be really good, especially after last year. But I think they just weren't really ready for it, and we're seeing that now.
Mhm. Wrapping up with our last SEC team that's ranked right now, that will be Missouri. How are we feeling about Missouri?
Yeah. Missouri, one loss, Missouri. Their
Mm-hmm.
loss is a bad loss, though. I mean, it's not bad because Texas A&M is proving to be really good, but it's bad because you lost by 31 points.
Yeah.
So you look at the rest of their schedule, though. They actually have the easiest remainder of their schedule. They have to go to Alabama, but then after that, and to South Carolina, which again we're going to keep talking about as a little trap game, as
Mm-hmm.
well as Arkansas at the end of the year. But when it comes to those top 25 teams, they only have one left. When most of the teams that we've already talked about have two, maybe even three. But that being said, I think because of that, their resume isn't going to be that strong. They might. I think their route is some of those other teams ahead of them lose some games, and they're able to sneak into the SEC championship game by just remaining steady. Obviously, beating Alabama in Tuscaloosa would be really really big for their chances, but
Mm.
I don't think that's going to happen. So I'm out on Missouri at this point too. So I guess that means looking at it, I think Texas is a bona fide in. LSU I have in. Georgia or Alabama, definitely one of them's getting in. I would be surprised if both don't. It would take some serious
Okay.
slip ups under Kirby Smart or Kalen DeBoer there. Ole Miss though I don't think is getting in. Tennessee isn't getting in. Missouri I don't think is getting in. And I don't think Texas A&M is getting in. I don't think Texas A&M is getting in without bumping out Alabama or Georgia. Basically, is sort of where we're at.
Okay. So maybe between Texas A&M, Georgia, and Alabama, two of them at most would make it, is what you're
Yeah,
saying.
yeah,
Got you. The one spot where I disagree with you is actually at the end that Missouri, although their schedule overall may not be that strong for their resume, like to be a 2-loss SEC team potentially, if they do lose to Alabama in Tuscaloosa, being a 2-loss SEC team is still a really great resume to have, even if you don't have super strong wins. So I think the path might be there for them just solely because of that. But I hear
I
you.
mean, I hear you. The fact is, right now, you look at their resume. They they're they have two quality wins right now, but they aren't even like that quality of wins. If Vanderbilt continues to stay on the up and up, then that could turn into a really, really good win for them.
Mhm.
The other one is Boston College, and Boston College I think is 3-3 now, maybe 4-3. They just got blown out by Virginia Tech last night. So it's like, oh, beat a top 25 opponent, but you didn't beat them that soundly, and they actually don't look like a top 25 team anymore. They were at a top 25 ranking at that point because they'd beaten Florida State, in week 1, and Florida State is absolute garbage. So yeah, so I hear you, but I also look at it and think about, with this 12-team playoff, the committee is not going to want to show significant SEC bias. They opened it up so they could have more teams from different conferences, and it would be really hard to look at, let's say a two loss, a 2-loss ACC team, and their losses are, let's say Miami or Louisville right now. They have 2 losses. Let's say Louisville wins out. Their losses came to Notre Dame and I forget who else. But let's say they win out and their 2 losses though are to Notre Dame and someone else, like, and leave them out for a 2-loss Missouri, which their losses are against their only like really, really good teams that they play all year. Especially because if 2-loss Louisville is there, they will have beaten Miami. So I see what you're saying, and I think the committee could do it. I think there would be a lot of question marks about it unless it's like, hey, listen, Missouri is the last 2-loss team, and then we have a ton of 3-loss teams. But that's never the case that point at the end of the season. So
I hear you. Louisville, though, running the table will be difficult because Miami, as you said, but they still got to play Clemson at Clemson, and they got to play Pittsburgh, who's ranked right now. And so
right,
they don't got it particularly easy either. Also, their other loss was to now top or their number 21 ranked SMU. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So maybe that isn't as good of an example.
I hear you, though. I hear
But
you.
yeah.
Yeah. Sweet. All righty. Moving on, we have one last college football topic, and that would be fraud alert. Are there any particular teams right now that you feel fall in the bucket of frauds? Who are you thinking about? Where do you feel like these fake wins are coming at?
Yeah. So number one for me right now is Penn State. They're number 3 in the country. You look at what they've done, and you're like, can you explain it to me? Um, they almost lost at home to Bowling Green. They won 34-27, and Bowling Green was in that game, like the entirety of it. They destroyed Kent State, but I think Kent State like hasn't won a game this year. Or like I don't know. I think they've won a couple of games, but really, really bad. They beat UCLA at home. I think UCLA is 1-5, so that's not that great of a win, especially considering only won by 16 points. And then the win over USC. Again, USC is a 3-loss team, right? Like I'm looking at this at what they've done, and I'm just not seeing where they've played well enough and won against good enough opponents by enough to warrant being a number 3 team in the country. Like, granted, okay, they're undefeated. Well, if you look at the top 25, you still have Miami, who's below them. You have Iowa State, who's below them. You have BYU, who's below them. Indiana, who's below them. Pitt, who's below them. Army, who's below them. And Navy, who's below them, who are all undefeated. Now, not all of those teams should be ahead of them. I don't think any of those teams should be ahead of them, but I just think that Penn State might get into the playoff because you look at the rest of their season and they play Ohio State, and that's the only other ranked opponent that they have. Um, and so they might get into the top 25 because of that, or get into the top 12 because they go 11-1 and their loss comes to Ohio State. But you know, I'm not believing in this team. I don't believe in Drew Aller. I have never seen James Franklin win the big game. I just don't see where this team is up there. Yeah.
Mhm. I hear you. I hear you. I think Penn State, like, they're clearly on a track to be a one-loss team. And so are they a top 3 or 4 team in the country? Probably not. But
Right.
are they a top 8 team in the country? Probably, maybe. Like,
Maybe.
I don't know that they're not floating around there.
Yeah.
So I
I
don't
think
know
we're
about
kind of. I
frauds.
think
Maybe top 3 for frauds. Like, I hear you. I hear
I
you.
say I say fraud because I'm thinking fraud like there are lots of teams that make playoffs in all sports, and it's like you made the playoffs, but like, are you actually going to be competitive in the playoffs? And so that's where I'm saying fraud. I think Penn State's kind of teetering between that. We might be hosting a first round game, or we might be on the road in a first round game. Because, like, yes, Penn, they have Ohio State, and that'll be their whiteout game, but they'll probably lose it. But I mean, they go to Wisconsin. They have their bye this week, and then they go to Wisconsin. They might lose that one. They go to Minnesota late. They might lose that one. So, like, if they could be a 1-loss team that's in like the 5 to 8 range, or they could be a 2-loss team that's in the 9 to 12 range.
Right.
But once they get there, certainly after the first round, like, I don't see them playing. Our top 4 are going to be Texas, Georgia, or no, Texas, Oregon, Ohio
Okay.
State, likely. We'll see probably whoever the number 2 team in the SEC is, whether that's LSU or Alabama, and I just don't see them beating any of those teams in the playoffs.
I hear you. I hear you. Okay. So Penn State clearly in the top 5 as the odd man out. Texas has looked great. They've made a playoffs. Oregon has looked talented. They've made a couple of playoffs, maybe not in the last couple of years. Ohio
Right.
State and Georgia are certified, like, clearly playoff teams the last couple of years. So Penn State, I get that they're the odd man out. Anybody else ranked that you're feeling definitely fraud alert as far as where they're placed right now or how people are viewing them?
Yeah. So, with the risk of sounding or of ruining my own team, um, I don't, and my own team's conference. I'm not believing in Miami right now. Um,
Mm,
they started off the year looking great. They destroy Florida at Florida. They destroy Florida A&M. They destroy Ball State. They destroy South Florida. And then they host Virginia Tech and somehow win that game because ACC officials are literally the worst in college football. Literally the worst in college football. And take that game away from Virginia Tech. And then they go to Cal, and again, ACC officials, the worst in
Weak
college
out.
football, just
Yeah.
barely get away with that one. So I actually think that Miami is going to lose to Louisville at Louisville this week.
Woo! Okay.
I think Louisville is better than their record, and I'm thinking Louisville is going to win that game. Um, they'll beat Florida State because who won't? They'll beat Duke, Georgia Tech again, a tough out. Wake Forest is bad, and then they go to Syracuse. They'll probably beat Syracuse the last game of the year. I would like to think that Syracuse will win that game. We'll see. But it's just like I just think that eventually in ACC play, it's going to catch up with Miami the way they're just barely like eking out these wins. I think it's going to start this week. I think we may see that against Georgia Tech, and we may see that against Syracuse too. And so I would be very surprised if they lose all three of those games and like miss the playoff. Like that would shock me. But I don't believe in them as a team that could do some damage in the playoff. Even if they do go undefeated and win the ACC, and so they get one of the first four byes, I'm still not convinced that they're going to win their second round matchup.
Mm-hmm. I hear you. I hear you. Speaking of, you were talking about Miami pretty luck beating your Syracuse Orange in the last week of the year. Just quickly, do you feel like your Syracuse Orange have a shot to maybe not make the playoffs, but make some noise, be ranked at the end of the year? Because their schedule has a couple of scrappy teams, but like teams that are beatable.
Yeah.
Miami obviously is the toughest team there. Pittsburgh's been doing well, but Virginia Tech, Boston College, Cal, all scrappy teams. Just like for a second, a little snippet of you being a Syracuse fan. You got any feelings about them? Not as frauds, but just generally.
Yeah. I think this game against Pitt is going to be really, really telling next week. They play on Thursday night at Acrisure Stadium, or as I know it, Heinz Field.
Yes.
I grew up 2 hours east of Pittsburgh. It's always going to be Heinz Field. But if they win that game, and the reason I say this, if they win that game, they actually could be in the trajectory to make the playoff. Like that is how big that game is, because one, Pitt is a very good football team. They're one of, I think, like 9 remaining undefeated teams. Also, Syracuse just cannot beat Pitt at Pitt. It doesn't matter who the coach is. They couldn't do it under Dino Babers, except, yeah, no, last year they played them in Yankee Stadium. So, yeah, they couldn't do it under Dino Babers. They couldn't do it under Scott Schaefer. I went to 2 games where they played Pitt at Pitt under Doug Marrone, and they couldn't do it then. It's just, for whatever reason, that is just their kryptonite, So, like, when I looked at their season this year, I was like, I see 2 losses on their plate, and that's Miami and that's Pitt, because they just don't beat Pitt. It doesn't matter how good or bad Pitt is. So if Fran Brown were to prove like, no, like, hold on, new dog in town, new team, and they win that game, then man, I'm looking at the rest of their schedule. I'm like, they're hosting Virginia Tech. Virginia Tech looked really good against Boston College on Thursday, but Boston College hasn't looked really good since they played Missouri. I think they can win that game. They go to Boston College. Again, I'm not really believing in Boston College. The game at Cal will be interesting. The FPI is so weird. So I keep looking. According to the FPI, the only game that Syracuse is going to win the rest of the year is UConn. And I'm like, how? Like they're giving Cal like a 79% chance to beat Syracuse in that game. And I'm like, Cal is 3-3. They haven't won in the ACC. Like, whatever. FPI is FPI. But still, that game could be a detriment there. But if they beat Pitt, I see a world where they're 10-1 when they host Miami at the end of the year, and potentially the thing that sucks about conference realignment and how big conferences are is you don't have as many of those win in your end games anymore. When it comes to conference championship, in the past, if that was what was happening in the last game of the season, it would likely be if Syracuse wins, they're playing in the ACC championship. But in the ACC right now, there are 4 teams that are undefeated in the conference: Clemson, Miami, Pitt, and SMU. Now, Syracuse might beat Pitt and then Miami, and that would be good. But Clemson and SMU would need to ask one of them to lose at least one, probably 2, just to guarantee that they're in. So I'm like, I see the path. I think we'll learn a lot this week. I think they got to buy at a really good time. All-American Marlo Wax is coming back from injury, which I like. So who knows? But I want to tamper my expectations because, like, they've had this issue of playing to the level of their opponents this year. I feel like, Ohio is different because it was Coach Fran's first game as a head coach ever. So like, I won't hold that one. But Georgia Tech, they were up 31-14 in the fourth quarter, and Georgia Tech came back and they won 31-28. They lost to Stanford. Stanford is 2-4 this year. They lost by 2 points. Stanford's 2-4. They beat UNLV 44-41, and in which that one I felt like actually they rose to the level of their opponent. But still, there also were times that I'm like, we should be like destroying them right now. They beat NC State 24-17. Again, a road conference game, first road conference game of the year, but still, it's like NC State isn't that good, you know. So we'll see. There's a chance that they do it. I'm not going to rule it out, but I'm not super convinced.
Got you.
Well, guys, thanks so much for tuning in. This has been a long episode, but we haven't talked college football in a while, and so it was good to talk about it, especially now that we're at the halfway point. We'll probably ramp up a little more of the college football talk in the coming weeks as we get closer and closer to the end, and the NFL just keeps going. So we'll be able to take care of that too. So thank you all so much for watching, for supporting us, and have a great day, everybody.
Peace.